So some of these leading scientists are saying, look, we have to completely re-educate even all of our scientists. That's how problematic it is and how fundamentally challenging this is. And we talk about needing a paradigm shift to tackle the problems we've got. I didn't realize how deep that paradigm shift goes. It goes to the very heart of what we think is true and not true.
Welcome back to The Responsible Edge, the podcast exploring how to balance profit with purpose in an increasingly complex world. I'm Charlie Martin, your host and founder of TrueMark. And our article this week is titled, How Are Sustainability Standards Driving Real-World Change?, which looks at the evidence behind sustainability standards, showing where they drive real impact and where they fall short on their own. And I'm absolutely thrilled to say that my guest today to unpack all of this is Pooran Desai, founder of OnePlanet.com, creator of One Planet Living, and one of the original architects behind the thinking that shaped the UN Sustainable Development Goals. Pooran, it's absolutely fantastic to have you on the show this morning. Thank you so much for giving up some of your time.
Thanks, Charlie. It was great to be here.
Now, Pooran, for those that they won't be able to tell, but you have done some brilliant work at your end in managing to set things up with various different documents overlaying elements of your screen so that I've got you absolutely primed and ready to go for this one. So thank you for bearing with me on that front. For those listeners and viewers who are immediately diving over onto LinkedIn and searching your name and trying to bring up your LinkedIn profile to understand a bit more about OnePlanet.com, and the work that you're doing at the moment, can you save them the journey and just give us a little bit more meat on the bones about what you guys are doing?
Yeah, so Charlie, OnePlanet.com, it's a technology platform using very different database technology to help people make better, more joined up decisions. So it's really a systems-based approach. It has its roots a long time ago from my background in neuroscience, very early days of neural network modeling, which people will, of course, know that most AI today, or what we call AI, is based on neural networks. I've had work for over 30 years in sustainability. And for me, the thing about sustainability is really an understanding at the core of it that everything is interconnected. And in fact, interconnected is not even a strong enough word. Ultimate reality is indivisible. And so we've developed delusional ways of trying to deal with the real world. We try and deal with it in silos, which exists in our own minds, in our own organizations, in our own cultures, but those silos do not exist out there. And so how do we give people the tools to show them the interconnectedness of things, help them develop a different understanding of the world based on really its ultimate indivisibility, that everything affects everything else, and that all the problems we face in the world now are problems which can't be solved in silos. They have to be solved in a completely interconnected way. And as I say, interconnected is not even a strong enough word for it.
And how does OnePlanet.com specifically go about enabling this? Like you mentioned, it's a technology platform. Like what does it do?
So OnePlanet.com is really like a mind mapping technology. So we help people map any policy, strategy, plan, project into its atomic structure, as we call it, of outcomes, what you want to achieve, actions, how you're going to achieve them, indicators, what you might track, and then you can playfully link them up, and people can go to the website and even without logging in, have a little go on basics of that. So within 2 minutes, you can get the fundamentals of what we're trying to do. But once our users or we have put those strategies, policies, projects, plans into outcomes, actions, indicators, it's a common framework where we can then connect any of these together in a group, which we call an ecosystem, identify them where the crossovers are, where where the conflicts are, gaps, opportunities, identify what we call shared outcomes, then collaborate on those shared outcomes across silos of public sector, private sector, voluntary sector, silos of different organizations, silos of different departments within the same organization. So it's a combination of systems mapping with collaboration. And I think we're pretty unique in allowing massive collaboration to happen. And the big breakthrough for us was that almost all data that companies use, enterprises use, or governments use are in what's known as SQL databases, where the data is held in rows and columns like an Excel spreadsheet. But there's a fundamentally different type of database, technically known as a graph database. I prefer to call it a network database, where information is held on the basis of its interconnectedness. And those are two such different ways of holding data that you can't track interconnectedness through the standard databases. And so I think, may have been the first company to start using these graph databases, network databases, really to tackle sustainability. If sustainability is understanding interconnectedness, then we have to use these different types of databases. And they are the databases that underpin social media networks, interestingly. So, for example, Facebook knows who you are, who your friends are, who your friends' friends are, which restaurants they go to. So you might like to go to the same restaurant. Now, you cannot track that through a set of Excel spreadsheets. Just mathematically, you end up with combinations which end up with it will take longer than the universe has been around to understand those connections if you were processing it with standard computers. So we need a very different way of understanding, presenting data, and enabling people to make decisions based on an understanding of the big picture rather than of the detail.
In terms of the sort of the attitudes of the organizations that you work with, this is quite a sort of an innovative, sort of revolutionary thing that they're doing, presumably, not just changing the way they're thinking about the way that they approach these system change requirements, but ultimately the way that they handle their own data. Is that something that you're noticing, that people are sort of understanding the significance of working with you in this way and how different it is to what they were doing before?
Some are. So our main customers are local and regional government at the moment.
Right.
Our best customer is the South Downs National Park Authority. Started using our platform about 4 years ago. So they're a regional government, very relatively small organization, and deliver most of their work through partnerships with other organizations, including, in their case, I think it's 14 what they call contributing authorities. So borough councils, county councils, and district councils. So they have a complex partnership to manage, and they struggle to do that without understanding the interconnectedness of things. But I think there's there's a deeper reason in that, as a national park, it's got a lot of ecologists in it, and ecologists are brought up with an understanding of interconnectedness. So I think it's not a surprise to me in that way that actually it's turning out that a nature-led organization actually is starting to take this on. But we've got London boroughs using it. We're starting to use it for resilience mapping. Community groups are using it to collaborate with local governments. We got businesses starting to use it as well. So you don't need to understand the metaphysics of it to understand really that we need to work in systems, not silos. So that's coming through.
And I think what's so sort of great to hear, if you like, is that I think I've had so many conversations with people where we've talked about the need for systems thinking, a collaborative approach, partnership, the sharing of insight, etc., to enable us to address some of these issues. And it almost is like everybody talks about it, but really then prompted on well, what does that actually look like in the real world? Like, what can you do to enable that? Well, it sounds like oneplanet.com is literally providing the framework and the systems to lean into that and to prove that you're committed to collaboration and partnership in this to address these issues. Is that a fair observation?
It's a very fair observation. I would phrase things slightly differently in some ways, but I believe we're the only intuitive systems mapping plus collaboration tool out there. But I think it's not about proving that this is a different way or helping people prove that they are committed to this. I think it's actually helping them see the world in a completely different way. Okay. Mm-hmm. Now, that brings me back. I wasn't expecting this, but I was in neuroscience research at very early days of neural network modeling, and I've come back full circle to the neuroscience. Okay. So it turns out that our brains are divided into two. So this is the work of, I'm going to say, the greatest thinker of our time, and many people would concur with me on that. His name's Dr. Ian McGilchrist, psychiatrist, philosopher, neuroscientist, literary critic, who really has brought together neuroscience with epistemology. How do we know what's real? Ontology, what is real? So bringing together metaphysics, neuroscience and philosophy together in an incredible way. So I would recommend people look up his work, his latest or his newer book, which came out about, I think 4 years ago, The Matter with Things. Many people, including me, say it's the most important book for 300 years. The reason for that is that there are two ways of understanding how the world works, or what Ian says is attending to reality. So the first is really how the left half of the brain sees the world. So it sees it as separate parts. Okay? But it literally cannot put those parts together. It might know what a head is, what an arm is, what a leg is. If you ask that half of the brain to put those parts together, it might stick a leg on top of the head. It doesn't know it's got it wrong, but it's even worse than that. It can't be persuaded it's got it wrong. So it's the part of the brain that also likes to work in Excel spreadsheets.
Yes.
Okay. And literally becomes so focused on the parts that it can't understand that, the world doesn't work in those separate parts. Mm-hmm. While the right half of the brain can see the bigger picture. It understands nuance. It can see other people's point of view, and is therefore more collaborative. So it gets information not just from our own internal thoughts, but also from the heart, from the gut, from the world outside. And so what Ian says is that actually our culture has become very focused for the last 300 years, very focused on left brain thinking, which is the idea that the more you know about the parts, the better you're able to manage the whole. Now, that is fundamentally delusional. Okay, so literally neuroscientists are saying the culture we've created and the ways of working we are creating really embody a delusional relationship with reality. Okay. So, for example, we think when we are managing the cells in our Excel spreadsheet, that we are managing reality. No, we're not. We are managing cells in our Excel spreadsheet. And for every number in our Excel spreadsheet that we try to manage, there are millions of numbers affecting that number. And it goes all the way to the heart of now reductionist science as well, the particular form of science we've got, which focuses on the detail. Mm-hmm. And this idea that the more we know about the detail, the better we're able to understand the whole. Now, that is a massive assumption which we've forgotten that we've made. So the whole is not just made up of the parts. So the more you know about the parts doesn't mean you understand how the whole works, because the whole also influences the parts. Okay, makes sense. So you cannot describe how the whole works by an understanding of the parts.
Is the point that if you study the individual parts, that ultimately and study them in isolation of one another, that is what leads to the delusional perspective when you then try and package all of those parts back together to conceive of the whole.
Absolutely. And I'll give a couple of examples about that, how that plays out in practice. So some of these leading scientists are saying, look, we have to completely re-educate even all of our scientists because, that's how problematic it is and how fundamentally challenging this is. And we talk about needing a paradigm shift to tackle the problems we've got. I didn't realize how deep that paradigm shift goes. It goes to the very heart of what we think is true and not true. Okay. So as an example, we think, okay, science, brilliant, it can solve problems. Look, I would go as far as to say you can make the case that all the problems we've got in the world today have been caused by scientists.
Mm-hmm.
So, for example, look at how we applied science and reductionist science to agriculture. Okay, so we said, okay, we want to increase yield. Okay? Yeah. So let's increase yield. So we focus on yield. So we measure yield. Okay.
Yeah.
And yes, for a period, for the last 70 years or so, maybe we did increase yield. But at what cost? We've destroyed half of all soils on the planet. We've created pesticides, which are causing, the insect apocalypse, and then all sorts of ramifications on biodiversity loss. We've created artificial fertilizers, which run off into the rivers, created problems with the rivers, and then dead zones in the oceans. We've increased yield, but we've reduced nutrient density of the food. So we're now having to eat more to try and get nutrients, and becoming actually malnourished because we have increased yield of our in our farming system. And so scientists tend to take all the credit for whatever they want to take credit for, and take no responsibility for all what are called side effects. But those are not side effects; they're effects. So we try and diminish the impact or the understanding of the bigger picture by saying, oh, they're side effects and we can cure it. No, we can't. It's because the very approach of focusing on the detail and trying then to manage a living world which doesn't work in those separate parts is fundamentally problematic. And that's why we have to develop a completely different way of dealing with reality.
How optimistic are you that we can turn this around?
It's a very good question, and I'm not sure how to answer that, because I would say really studying Ian McGilchrist's stuff, and actually I couldn't have understood what he was saying without also studying Alan Watts or listening to Alan Watts. I don't know if you know Alan Watts, 1970s. Over the course of it was over the course of lockdown that I spent 20 hours a week for over 3 years, so probably about 3,000 hours unlearning everything I'd been taught at school, everything I'd been taught at Oxford, everything I'd been taught at Cambridge, everything I'd been taught in my professional life. Understand just how delusional our relationship with reality is. But I think also it's just given me a completely different perspective on the world. So the world now I see, and this is where scientists are going as well, is fundamentally the world is best described as the universe is best described as a conscious living organism. And we are a feature in that, not even a part of that. And Eastern philosophical thought is probably, and religious thought is probably closest to that. So I call myself a Taoist and a born-again Hindu. Ian McGilchrist calls himself a Taoist and a Christian. You get to the point where actually a religious understanding of the world, you might call it spiritual. I like to push it a bit further into religious, is a fundamentally more truthful version of working in the world than being a reductionist materialist scientist.
Mm-hmm.
It's very interesting that the way forward we need to go is actually to think less and experience more. And that's coming through with concepts like embodied experience. That is absolutely right. Embodied experience is closer to the truth than anything that can be documented by a scientist or in a set of sustainability standards.
In a scenario in which we did collectively adopt a new way of thinking less and feeling and experiencing more and having that more sort of appreciation, if you like, of the whole, what role does the left-hand brain sort of thinking, if you like, have in that new world? Like, does it still have utility? And if so, what is that?
So the left hemisphere can be a very good servant, but it thinks it knows more than it does, just as I would say scientists think they know more than they do.
Yeah.
And the right half of the brain it should be the master. So we should be asking very different questions. It's not how do we fix this? It's how do we want to live and be in the world?
Mm-hmm.
And I think that's where authenticity comes from. And I know part of this discussion is going to be talking about sustainability standards or standards, and why I am very reluctant to put much credence behind the value of standards in sorting that out, because actually it creates inauthenticity in response. It becomes more about ticking a set of boxes rather than really thinking, what are we trying to do here? And what is our motivation for doing this?
And Pooran, as if by magic, you have beautifully segued us onto the next part of our conversation. Would you start by perhaps just introducing and summarizing the article that we've kind of titillated throughout the beginning of our conversation?
Yeah, so thanks, Charlie, for putting me onto it. How are sustainability standards driving real world change by ISEAL? Now, I think ISEAL, I don't know much about ISEAL, but they're an alliance of, I think, certifiers, consultants and companies who see the value in standards in creating a better world. So this article was looking at what's the, is there evidence for sustainability standards driving real world change? So they were looking at the evidence, and it says, the article says, for example, let's look at the social issues. So we can see, for example, that in the cases that they looked at, that incomes went up modestly, they say, but incomes went up for small scale producers who are parts of certification schemes. They said economically, there's evidence that it can boost exports from poor countries, for example. Environmentally, cocoa farmers in Ghana, where they became parts of certification systems, ended up managing the land in such a way that it was better able to sequester carbon. Or Forest Stewardship Council certification has been introduced, there's more biodiversity. So they say there's very good evidence that certification can drive real world outcomes. But they do say, to be fair, they say, look, it's not the whole solution. So, for example, we had pushback on ESG. So where does that leave us? But their response is to say to strengthen standards and certifications. And I would say, no, that's absolutely the wrong conclusion to draw.
I thought you might. That was a brilliant introduction, Pooran. Thank you for sharing that. Let's start with that that point then, and let's use that as our springboard for the rest of our conversation. Why, in your mind, and I think we've obviously touched on this in our previous element of our conversation, but what is it when you look at sustainability standards and you think, what role do they play or should they play in perhaps this new world that One Planet is trying to develop? Like, will there just be no need for any standards or certifications in that world, or do they still have a role to play?
Yeah, Charlie, I'll come on to answering that, but first, maybe I can give a little bit of background on my own experience of standards. So again, I set up, co-founded environmental organization Bioregional back in the early 1990s. And as part of that, we, with colleagues, set up a couple of sustainable forestry businesses. And we had a very close working relationship with WWF. And in fact, I used to get on very well with the foresters there. We were in a pub in Godalming, and they were just conceiving the idea of the Forest Stewardship Council. Advertised it, wasn't it? So I was there, if you like, in the pub when these sorts of ideas were starting to be discussed. And our own forestry. So we set up a couple of forestry companies. One was in really reintroducing traditional coppice woodland management into woodlands in the southeast of England, with the idea of replacing unsustainable imports with more locally produced sustainable wood products as a way of generating employment, as well as having positive nature outcomes. Because coppice management, you may be familiar, traditional woodland management, where you go in every 5 10, 20, 30 years and harvest the wood, it regrows. But in harvesting the wood, you create these open woodland habitats, which are fantastic for wildflowers, butterflies, particular types of birds, nightingales, dormice, the small pearl-bordered fritillary butterfly depends on it, for example. Wood white butterfly depends on these sorts of habitats. So it was a way of generating jobs at the same time as displacing unsustainable imports, and we're particularly interested in charcoal coming from mangrove swamps. So as we went through, we set up a forest marketing company, and we ended up with a network of 70 small-scale woodland producers around the country producing local charcoal and delivering it to their local stores. So we call this network production. So I've always been interested from my neuroscience days of distributed systems. How do you organize things in a distributed way? So we call that network production, which was centralized management, but decentralized production and decentralized supply. So, for example, with B&Q, with our 70 producers, they would all deliver to their local B&Q stores, and we'd have some point of sale material reconnecting people with their woodlands. So this was absolutely fantastic. But then B&Q committed to Forest Stewardship Council certification and said all products need to be Forest Stewardship Council certified. So we had to introduce FSC certification to our producers, and it was an absolute nightmare. And I absolutely hated it. It added a level of bureaucracy, which was expensive. And ultimately, we weren't able to continue that company beyond during the global financial crisis, which was the ESG kickback that hit us. That was not the only reason. But why did I hate the FSC standards? It's because we couldn't tick the boxes that they wanted to tick. Okay. And it was a nightmare fighting with the bureaucracy of the FSC. But it was worse than that, because we were working, for example, with woodland workers, woodland managers, who were sometimes third, fourth generation woodland workers. They had an indigenous implicit understanding of the woodland. Okay. Mm-hmm. They were seeing things, they lived it, they breathed it, they smelt it. They understood how to do things. They were part of the woodland.
Yes.
And then we had to get these certifiers in from SGS Forestry, as it turned out. They came in, graduates in their 20s, and they were telling these woodland workers what they should be doing. And I said, you just have nowhere near the understanding that these woodland workers in Kent, in the Lake District, in Scotland, you've got nowhere near their knowledge and understanding. And yet they are having to kowtow to you and tick your boxes.
And Pooran, what you're describing here in brilliant sort of case example is, I suppose, the worst of what a sort of standardization, the impact of standardization in terms of a certification of this nature. Just coming back to because I'm particularly interested in whether or not you see a role for, let's take the very best of certification and standards. Like, maybe not that example, but those that work brilliantly, those that are sort of adaptive enough to real world circumstances and the nuance of particular organizations, but still at the heart and the core of them have some real value in terms of the impact that they have upon collective behavior. Like, is there a role in this new change of attitude and change of sort of consciousness that comes to that looks at the whole and the interconnectedness of everything? Is there still a role for standards and certifications in that world?
Yes, but very limited. But before I properly answer that, I want to say, when this article by iSeal talks about evidence, of course, they didn't look at how many indigenous groups have and ways of managing the forest have been destroyed by certification. And I can give you one very good example of that. So this whole thing about, I'm going to say this is why the paradigm has to change and our way of talking about things have to change. Evidence is only what you look for. Okay. What about all the things you're not looking for? So we gave the agriculture example. We looked at evidence for increasing yield. But what are we not looking at? And that's the right hemisphere is much more aware and it's much more open to things that we are not focused on.
Yeah.
Okay. So the other thing about evidence is, so I would question, we absolutely have to move away from evidence-led policy making.
Right.
Strategy. Okay. We can be evidence-informed, which is a very different process from evidence-led. So I would question what evidence is, what evidence have we chosen, and also that you cannot create the future based on evidence. Evidence is always in the past. And it's like, as Alan Watts would say, trying to drive looking in the rear view mirror. It doesn't work. Evidence-based policy making absolutely, doesn't work. Evidence-informed policy making is useful. Okay, so let's understand the limitations of what scientists and policymakers call evidence. You choose the evidence based on what you decide to focus on. And by the way, I just want to come back to the neuroscience of it. Sorry, I will answer your question, but this is just too interesting from the neuroscience perspective. When you focus, we think of that as a very positive thing. In the brain, it's actually it's an inhibitory thing. You are preventing information coming into your conscious or your cognitive processes when you focus on something. So focusing on something is ignoring other information. That's the neuroscientific basis for focus. Okay. Now, very interestingly, focus is a process of ignorance. Okay. And that's why in Hindu philosophical thought, focus and thought is the origin of ignorance. So everything you think about develops ignorance. So coming back to where's the role of sustainability standards? Look, I think that achieving sustainability standards or certification should never be considered excellence. Okay, because excellence, you cannot define excellence. It goes beyond, and particularly when you're talking about the future, the real excellence in the future can't be put in a tick box. And it's beyond, and it transcends anything that we know at the moment. Okay. So I remember, for example, with Science-Based Targets Initiative. Now, I haven't kept up to date with it, but I remember it in its early days where it said, okay, let's look at these different industries and let's look at processes or standards which enable us to reduce, by X amount in transport, by X amount in housing, by X amount in whatever else. I don't know whether that's the process now. Without really recognizing that the biggest changes are going to be when we, for example, get rid of transport, when we create walkable, cyclable cities, So, and those weren't really science-based targets. They were really scenario-based targets because we know all of that was based around, and budgeting is not science. Climate budgets are not science. They are scenarios. They are models, which, of course, now we generally agreed we can't stay under 1.5 degrees. So how does that fit at all with Science-Based Targets Initiative? I don't know. I always thought it was going to be a disaster, and I think it is a disaster. So I'm going to be extremely rude here, but just because it's just a way of saying it. But I heard someone say, regs are for the dregs. Okay.
We've got our headline for the show. Thank you, Pooran.
No, look, I think that's a little bit harsh, but it's this one. But of course, it's a bit of alliteration. I think helps. look, we should use standards to make sure that the worst practices don't happen.
Mm-hmm.
But we should not use standards or even think of standards as driving excellence. We should think of them as creating a foundation below which we shouldn't fall, and then we should incentivize excellence. Okay.
Yeah.
So yeah, that's where I think standards do have a place, but and why we found it so difficult. So I created the One Planet Living framework, on which the UN SDGs are based. I coined the term, led the process to identify those, used it as universal set of principles. Did more real estate development. We worked with B&Q, wrote was used for the sustainability strategy for London 2012 Olympics, for example. So very successful, but it got very difficult as sustainability standards and certifications started to take hold, because then, it was all about getting the badge rather than developing the appropriate response, the right response for any particular solution.
And as you suggested, the obtainment of that particular standard should only ever be seen as the baseline. It's not the excellence, it's not the best practice. And so, but ultimately it's incentivizing organizations to go, we've ticked that box. We can then ultimately not have to necessarily invest energy, time and effort into trying to go beyond.
I would say it's worse than that.
Okay.
It's a promotion of those people who have ticked those boxes as leaders.
Okay.
That's where the problem is. So that's where, in effect, the greenwashing, in my view, comes in. Because of course it's an unholy alliance between the incumbents who have the money and the consultants and certifying organizations who have to get their money from the incumbents. Mm-hmm. So there is a tendency to end up kowtowing to the incumbents. So you see B Corp, for example. There are good things about B Corp, but may I tell another story? Have we got time?
We've got time for one more Pooran story before we go magic wand. Go for it.
Okay. So the story is, I took up long distance running very late in life, but I just run a marathon, and someone said, we should look at B Corp certification for the organization. And I looked at it and I thought, oh God, that looks like an absolute nightmare to fill in. So he said, oh, look, your initial assessment will take you about 4 hours to do. And I thought, oh God, this is what I really hate. I mean, I've got a very low threshold for that sort of administrative, bureaucratic task. But I said, okay, I've run a marathon. What I learned from that was just keep going, So I said, okay, I'll first side an afternoon, 4 hours, and I will just get to the end of it. Okay. And after 45 minutes of trying to fill in the B Corp assessment, I lost the will to live. I couldn't do it. And I don't know how anyone fills in. I think it's the CEOs who say, yes, we need this. And then some poor recent graduate has to trawl through it and complete it. And I just thought, how do you know what you're doing when you're ticking those boxes? What is the thing? And then you get things like, of course, questions like Nespresso having B Corp certification owned by Nestle, which, most of its products are selling junk food to kids, and, they're pushing out, they may have stopped it now, but pushing out boats into the Amazon. I don't know if you saw that documentary how Nestle have been sponsoring boats deep into the Amazon to get indigenous people off their traditional diets onto Nestle fast foods.
Oh, goodness.
And if that's not evil, I don't know what is. And so the thing is, standards end up often as a cloak to uncover an inauthentic conversation in society, which is about ticking the boxes rather than saying, what is this company actually trying to achieve?
I think it's super interesting, Pooran. I think the worst of certification standards are the sort of facilitation of the status quo and the masking of the reality, as you say, of what these organizations are actually intending to do. And it's certainly something that that has sort of been core and central to the work that we've been doing with both the Anti-Greenwash Charter and TrueMark. So it's interesting to hear you lay out the concerns as plainly as you have today. Pooran, though, we have run out of time, so I'm going to finish now, if possible, with the magic wand question, which I'm fascinated to see what you're going to do with, because I think you could do a lot with a magic wand, if I'm honest. But Pooran, if I was to hand you a magic wand and you could change one thing about the commercial world this instant, what would that one thing be?
It's interesting because, of course, that's not a systems approach. You want to change one thing. But what I would change is this point I was saying about authenticity. Okay. And I don't think standards can change markets. Okay.
Okay.
And so I'd go back and say, okay, when did companies, how were companies originally set up? So you can go back to the 19th century. Originally, companies were set up for public benefit. So you had to have public benefit in order to incorporate as a company. And in the 19th century, it was for housing, it was for infrastructure, whatever. And then into the 20th century in the States, and then into the late 20th century, we had the rise of neoliberalism and Thatcher and Reagan, particularly. By the way, I'm not anti-Thatcher, anti-Reagan in any way at all. But then it really became the policy to say that the company's priority is to the shareholder primacy. Mm-hmm. And then that got, I think in 2006 or something, that got written into UK law. Shareholder primacy is disastrous. I think so my magic wand would be to change things so that companies' first or primacy is to human and planetary health. And I would say you implement that as a set of guidance. You maybe have some standards which get rid of the worst, but you don't turn that process into a standard or certification process. You turn it into a guidance and discussion process and a rating process, which is very different, which I can go into. So I think there is a way of doing it. That would be my magic wand. Don't try and change the market. Change the companies which create, drive the market.
It's a brilliant suggestion, and you've described it so brilliantly. I know that felt like a whistle-stop tour, but that was a fantastic conversation. Thank you so much for joining me this morning and sharing some of your expert insight into this area. It's really, really interesting.
Thank you, Charlie. I've really enjoyed it.
And that's all for today's episode of The Responsible Edge. A huge thank you to Pooran Desai for joining me on today's show. As a reminder, this episode was brought to you by TrueMark, the mark of trusted communications. Visit truemark.com to learn more. I'm Charlie Martin. Thanks for listening. And don't forget to subscribe, share, and leave us a review. See you next time.